All right, so we've got this set of sources here on Kenneth Supreme McGriff. And today we're going to really kind of dive deep into his story, right? A life that kind of intersects with the drug trade, the music industry, and really some huge names in hip-hop. And we're relying heavily on his Wikipedia entry. It's actually surprisingly detailed in painting a picture of his rise and fall, you know?
Yeah, and what's really interesting here is that McGriff's story, it's not just about one man, you know? I mean, it really gives us a window into this, like, very specific time and place in American history.
For sure, for sure.
And, you know, his life kind of unfolded against this backdrop of the crack cocaine epidemic, the war on drugs, and, you know, this rapidly evolving hip-hop scene.
Okay, so let's sort of break this down a bit, right? I mean, Supreme wasn't just born a kingpin, so to speak. Like, what were the conditions that allowed someone like him to sort of build this drug empire in Queens?
Well, he was born in 1960 in New York City. And by the early 80s, like, he formed the Supreme team, right, in the Baisley Park houses in Queens.
Right.
And this was during the peak of the crack epidemic.
Right, right.
A time of, you know, just immense social and economic upheaval, particularly in marginalized communities.
Yeah.
So there was this void, this lack of opportunity, and a sense of desperation.
Yeah.
And that created fertile ground for these, you know, criminal enterprises to take root.
Absolutely. So how did he manage to, like, gain so much power so quickly? I mean, was it just brute force? Or was there more to it, something else?
Well, McGriff was a shrewd guy. He understood the streets, you know, and he built this hierarchical structure within the Supreme team with hundreds of members, right, working under him.
Wow.
And this level of organization, you know, allowed him to control the crack cocaine trade in their neighborhood, right, and amass significant wealth and influence.
Man, the name the Supreme Team, it sounds like something straight out of a movie, right? Was it as dramatic and intense as it sounds?
Oh, it was harsh, their reality, I mean. You know, just think about these young men, many teenagers even, drawn into this world of violence and crime. They were driven by poverty, the lack of opportunity, you know, and the allure of fast money.
Yeah.
And McGriff was able to capitalize on this, you know, this desperation, creating a system that was both, you know, highly profitable and incredibly dangerous.
Yeah, a recipe for disaster. And we know that in 1987, after a pretty big investigation, he's arrested and hit with a serious charge, continuing criminal enterprise.
Right.
And some people listening might be wondering, like, what exactly does that mean, right? What does that entail?
Yeah, that charge, you know, that goes way beyond a simple drug possession or distribution case, right? It indicates that McGriff wasn't just some, like, street-level dealer. He was the leader, right, of a large-scale ongoing criminal organization.
Whoa. So what kind of evidence led to that charge? I mean, was it purely about the drug trade, or were there other, you know, criminal activities involved?
Well, the indictment against McGriff and the Supreme team, it outlines this complex web of activity, including drug trafficking, money laundering, violence, you know.
Wow.
He wasn't just selling drugs. I mean, he was running this sophisticated operation, you know, with multiple layers and a clear chain of command. There were financial transactions, patterns of drug distribution, you know, witness testimonies. All this pointed to a large-scale ongoing criminal enterprise.
And that resulted in a 12-year sentence, right?
That's right, yeah. But, you know, even behind bars, his story isn't over.
Oh.
Yeah, he was released early on parole, only to, you know, end up back in prison for violations.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's a cycle we see all the time, you know, these challenges of reintegration for ex-offenders, this pull of the familiar and the difficulty of breaking free from the past.
It's tough, man.
Oh,
But McGriff, he did get out again.
Right.
Right, like in 1997.
That's right.
And this is where his story takes this really interesting turn, right? Like, he gets involved with Murder, Inc., that famous hip-hop label.
Yeah, that's right.
But just as his life seemed to be going in a new direction, like his past, it's about to catch up with him in a big way. I think a lot of people listening are probably curious, right?
Yeah.
About, you know, McGriff's connection to Murder, Inc. I mean, this is where his story kind of takes this turn into the music industry, which seems like, I don't know, a world away from, like, the streets of Queens.
Right, right.
You know what I mean?
Well, McGriff, I mean, despite his past, right, he really had this ambition, I guess, to be a filmmaker. And he actually even, like, sought out Irv Gotti.
Oh, wow.
The co-founder of Murder, Inc., one of the, you know, most successful hip-hop labels at the time.
Yeah, for sure. So, like, the former drug lord wants to make movies. Was this a genuine interest? Or was there something, you know, more to it? Like, was he using this to try to, like, I don't know, legitimize his wealth or, like, gain social acceptance?
Well, it's hard to say for sure what his real intentions were.
Mhm.
Some people think he saw filmmaking as a way to launder money, or to kind of like reinvent himself as a legitimate businessman.
Right.
Others think he really had a passion for storytelling and saw this as an opportunity to break into, a new industry. We know from the sources that, he wanted to adapt this crime novel into a film.
Oh, really? That's interesting. What was the novel about? Like, what drew him to that specific story?
Unfortunately, the sources we have don't give any specifics about the novel or like his creative vision for the film.
Okay.
But it's definitely an interesting clue, right? It could shed some light on, his motivations and aspirations, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. It's a shame we don't know more about that. But I mean, even without knowing the details, right? This connection to Murder Inc., it must have raised some red flags, especially with the FBI, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The FBI had been watching McGriff for years. And, his move into the music industry, this world often associated with, tons of cash and questionable business practices. I mean, it definitely got their attention.
For sure. And that scrutiny led to a raid on Murder Inc.'s offices, right?
Yeah.
What were they looking for?
They were investigating these allegations of drug trafficking, money laundering, specifically any financial ties between McGriff and the label. They thought maybe he was using Murder Inc. as a front, for his activities.
So this wasn't just about music anymore.
Right.
Like, this is about the potential for McGriff to be kind of like pulling the strings behind the scenes. What impact did this have on Murder Inc. and, the artists signed to the label?
Well, the raid, it really sent shockwaves, through the hip-hop community.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah, I mean, it cast this, shadow of suspicion over Murder Inc., raising questions about their legitimacy and where their funding was coming from.
Right.
And it put a lot of pressure on the artists associated with the label, like Ja Rule, Ashanti. I mean, their careers were really just taking off.
Oh, yeah. That's got to be so hard to navigate, right?
Yeah.
Like, imagine being, this young, talented musician, and all of a sudden, your label is being raided by the FBI.
Yeah.
And, like, your mentor's under investigation, and your name's being mentioned in connection with, this convicted drug lord.
Exactly. It's like a prime example of guilt by association.
Yeah.
Even if they weren't, directly involved in anything, their connection to McGriff and Murder Inc., it really tarnished their reputation, and it even threatened to, derail their careers.
Totally. But wasn't there also, like, this element of exploitation here? Like, was McGriff using these artists to kind of, like, further his own agenda, or were they actually drawn to, like, his mentorship and, the opportunities he offered?
It's a complex question. There's no easy answers. On one hand, McGriff's interest in the industry, it could have been, totally opportunistic. Like maybe he saw them as a way to, launder money or, get a foothold in this lucrative industry.
Right. Yeah.
On the other hand, maybe he really did believe in their talent and wanted to help them succeed.
Right. It's so hard to separate, those motivations,
Right.
especially given his history. And, this association, it had some very real consequences.
Right.
Like not just the legal scrutiny, but also this potential for violence. Like, we can't forget McGriff's name came up in the investigation into Jam Master Jay's murder.
Right. In that case, it's still unsolved. It hangs over this whole period.
Yeah.
And federal authorities, they investigated McGriff in connection with that 2000 shooting of 50 Cent.
Wow.
Yeah, there were allegations, right, that he orchestrated the attack because of, perceived disrespect in the rapper's lyrics.
It's crazy how, like, these events, especially violence, how they kind of mirrored, like, some of the themes and narratives that were popular in hip-hop, at the time. What do you make of that connection?
It shows the, complex and often, contradictory relationship between hip-hop and the streets. On one hand, hip-hop came about as a voice for the marginalized, right?
Right.
A way to express the realities of poverty, violence, oppression.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it also glamorized certain aspects of, street culture.
Yeah.
And it blurred the lines between reality and artistic expression.
And in McGriff's case, those lines, they became, I don't know, tragically intertwined. Like, this wasn't just about the music, the business anymore, right? This was about life and death.
Unfortunately, yeah, you're right. And in 2001, the violence, it escalated. And McGriff was implicated in these murders of Eric E. Moneybags Smith and Big Nose Trey Singleton.
And these weren't like just abstract crimes. I mean, these were real people with families, friends, whose lives were, changed forever.
Exactly, yeah. And the sources we have, they say that both murders, they were allegedly acts of revenge for the death of McGriff's friend, Colbert Black Just Johnson.
So this wasn't just about, like, turf wars,
Yeah.
drug deals gone wrong, right?
Oh,
Like
yeah.
this was about like personal vendettas
Yeah.
and this cycle of violence that just seemed to have, no end.
And these murders, they would lead to McGriff's, downfall, bringing this whole complex and controversial journey to an end. But, before we get into, the last chapter of his story, let's think for a second, right, about the impact he had on the
Yeah.
music industry, the lives of the people who, crossed his path.
Yeah. Okay. In the next part, we'll look at, the aftermath of his criminal career, right? Like his life behind bars and these sort of big questions that his story brings up about justice, redemption, and, that whole cyclical nature of violence. Okay. So we've gone through, Kenneth Supreme McGriff's rise and fall, right? His moves into the music world and all that violence that just seemed to follow him. So now I guess we're at the final chapter. Like, what were the consequences of his actions, and what's his life like these days?
Well, like we were saying, those 2001 murders, those are a big turning point. I mean, the prosecution, their argument was that they weren't just random acts of violence,
Right.
They were like calculated executions, murders for hire, like ordered by McGriff himself.
And the evidence, it was strong enough to actually like convict him. This wasn't just like rumors or speculation.
Oh, yeah. After this long trial in 2007, McGriff, he was found guilty. Murder conspiracy, drug trafficking, all related to those deaths. And he was sentenced to life.
Wow. So after everything, right, like building this whole empire, trying to reinvent himself, it all like falls apart. I mean, that's going to be a far cry from the streets he used to run, right?
Yeah, I mean, just picture the difference, right? Instead of the hustle and bustle of Queens, he's now at USP McCreary, that's in Kentucky, a high-security prison. And it's not just about, being locked up. It's about losing everything he built, right? The power, the influence, the freedom, all of it.
It's like this stark reminder, that building a life on like illegal stuff just doesn't last.
Exactly. Like McGriff's story, it's a classic example of, I don't know, hubris. That belief that you're above the law, that you're untouchable. But the law, even if it takes time, it usually wins. And there were other things going on too, right? Like law enforcement, their tactics were getting better, more sophisticated in how they went after organized crime.
Right.
And even the nature of these criminal enterprises, built on violence and not trusting anyone, I mean, that makes them really unstable from the start.
It's almost like, I don't know, like Shakespearean or something.
Yeah.
This rise and fall, this guy who seemed invincible and then, boom, brought down by the things he did himself.
Yeah, for sure. And it's a good reminder that the stuff we do, our actions, they have this ripple effect. They don't just impact us, but the people around us too.
You're talking about like the families of the victims, the communities affected by his, drug dealing, the artists who got caught up in the investigation, all that.
All of that, yeah. And even those people who might, admire parts of his story, like the ambition, the street smarts, whatever. They got to look at the whole picture, right? The violence, the destruction, the human cost.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about, that's for sure. And it leads to some like really tough questions. Like, is there any chance of redemption for someone like McGriff? Can a guy who, ordered murders, can he really feel sorry and like try to make up for what he did?
I think that's where everyone's own perspective comes in, right? Some
Yeah.
people might say, look, a life sentence, that's fair. What he did was so bad, there's no coming back from that. Others might think, well, even in prison, people can change. Maybe he can really face his past and, truly regret what happened.
It's complicated. No easy answers.
Mm-hmm.
But it's something we got to talk about, right?
Yeah.
Especially when we think about what our justice system is for, that balance between punishment and, rehabilitation.
Definitely. I mean, McGriff's story makes us think hard about these things. We got to go beyond simple ideas of good and evil. We got to see how complicated people really are.
Yeah, I agree. So, like, now that we're at the end of this whole deep dive, what's the one thing, like the most important takeaway that you'd want our listeners to, walk away with?
I think it's this McGriff story. It's a warning, right? It shows us that choices have consequences and that living outside the law, well, it often ends badly. But it's also a story that makes us look deeper, beyond just the headlines, like what were the social and economic things that shaped him, And it makes us think about these big ideas, justice, redemption, and whether people can really change.
Absolutely. We've covered a lot today, right? From the streets of Queens to, the top of the music world, and finally to life in prison. We hope you'll keep digging into this story, check out the sources we've got, and, decide for yourself what you think about Kenneth Supreme McGriff and what his story means. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.